It's time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword.
Welcome to the Double Stop. I'm Brian Sword. This week, I have producer Tom Werman on the show. Tom produced some of the biggest albums of the late 70s and 80s with artists such as Mötley Crüe, Poison, Dokken, Cheap Trick, Ted Nugent, and Twisted Sister. After 30 years and all that success, Tom decided to just walk away and open a luxury bed and breakfast with his wife. So this week is the story of Tom Werman, producer who sold millions of records but then knew when the time was right to just walk away.
This is our life, this is our song.
I'm from Boston. My parents were very musical, but only classical and show tunes. That's all that they ever played in the house. They had a subscription, kind of lifetime subscription to the Boston Symphony Orchestra, had the same seats every year, went like every Friday night. And they enrolled me in this subscription program Saturday mornings, kind of the orchestra for young people, where the head of the Boston Symphony, Harry Ellis Dixon, they'd play and then he would talk about the piece, and I loved it. It wasn't like Sunday school. I really liked it. My parents would not allow rock and roll to be played within earshot. Like my mother wouldn't. It's Tommy. If you want to play that, go in your room. So I would go in my room. My radio was on in my room constantly, basically all the time, except when I was doing homework. And I would record all the songs I wanted to record right off the radio, mono. I had this little web core, and I'd put the mic right on I'd lay the radio on its back, put the mic on there, and I had lots and lots of reel-to-reel tapes of great Boston DJs and great songs, all the hits of the 50s.
Now, did you start learning an instrument as you got a little older? I'm trying to figure out your path into production.
I taught myself guitar when I was about 14. And I got a few lessons in folk guitar from Jim Kweskin, who was a jug band hero in the late 50s. And then I had a folk group for a minute in senior year of high school. But when I got to college, we had a serious rock and roll band. and that was it. That was it.
And were you gigging out, playing originals, playing covers?
Nobody played originals then in the early 60s, really, except for bands that turned professional, like the Rascals and the McCoys and bands around New York. But we were a cover band, kind of a really good, slightly psychedelic wedding band. And we played fraternities, mixers, and colleges all around the Northeast, and a couple of very swanky private parties in New York for the beautiful people. And at one of those parties, I actually turned down a chance for our band to audition for Brian Epstein, which was a mistake, as I look back. But his lawyer was Nat Weiss in the city. And Nat Weiss, we were playing at a party where Andy Warhol was and Edie Sedgwick. And on a break, he came up to us and said, I think you guys are good, and I think Brian would like to hear you. And I said, well, look, we're in school, and, if we leave school to go on the road, then we'll lose our student deferments, and they'll probably ship us off to Vietnam. So we really can't. And that was it. Maybe if there hadn't been a Vietnam War, I could have been a rock star.
Yeah, that's some stakes, eh?
Yeah. but I probably would have OD'd anyway. So.
And what were you studying in school?
Oh man, I majored in economic geography in college because I couldn't stand the required English course. There were a couple of required courses that I just couldn't face, and I went to graduate business school. I got an MBA at Columbia, and I lasted 1 year in advertising, heavy-duty advertising for Gain Detergent and Jif Peanut Butter on Madison Avenue. And after a year, I was very unhappy there, and I wrote a letter to Clive Davis, who was the president of CBS Records, Columbia, and Epic. And I interviewed a bunch of people at CBS Records for about 2 or 3 months, and he hired me.
What did you say in your letter?
Well, it was, it's great to be in a position of strength, which means you're employed. So I wasn't saying, give me a job. I'm right out of school. I said I have a job here. I have an MBA from Columbia. I'm a guitar player. I'm a musician. I know a lot about rock and roll. I'm very unhappy, and I want to come work for you. I think I could really make a contribution because CBS is a really sophisticated record company, and so it was good enough for him to hand the letter over to the head of marketing, and he started with me, and they passed me around. I interviewed with the head of business affairs, the head of A&R, a bunch of people, and when I finally got to Clive, I said, I'm dying to work here, but I want to be in A&R, not marketing. It's just not for me. I have good ears, and I know a lot about rock and roll, and I'd like to work with that. And he said there are no jobs at Columbia that need filling right now, but Epic A&R needs an assistant to the director. A&R was so insignificant then, really, that the head of A&R wasn't even a vice president in the corporate structure. He was just a director, and that means a low pay grade, lower than a vice president. So I started. I went through 2 or 3 bosses, and then finally, after 6 years, I was given free rein to sign whom I wanted to, and I started with Ted Nugent.
That's pretty quick. So, what were you learning in the trenches there?
Well, it was an eternity for me. 6 years, really. I started at $10,000 a year. And after 6 years, I was making 18, barely enough to keep up with the cost of living.
Sure, yeah.
And then the first year I went into the studio. I guess I multiplied my income by a factor of about 15. I just made a god awful amount of money the first year in terms of the early 70s, and it was great. But during those 6 years, I had a lot of misgivings about my future in the record business. I knew I was good. I had a lot of confidence, but I didn't have enough confidence to go up against my boss when he made what turned out to be bad decisions. He was a great guy, and he knew a lot about music and music marketing, but not rock and roll. Nobody really knew about rock and roll at Epic, and my first signing was REO Speedwagon, and that was in 1970. But then I wasn't allowed to sign any. They passed on the 3 big bands that I wanted to sign, those being Kiss, Leonard Skinner, and Rush. And they didn't sign them.
Oh, no.
And so by the time, Kiss had become gigantic, I guess they thought, well, maybe this Werman guy knows something we don't know. So they said, who do you like? Who do you want to sign? And I said, well, I'd like to sign Ted Nugent. Who's he? So I started with Ted, and I didn't produce him, but I went into the studio and contributed a lot, enough so that his producer gave me co-producer credit, and then my first solo production was Cheap Trick in color. I signed Cheap Trick too, and then I signed Molly Hatchet. And I did all the records for all these bands while they were on Epic, and it was great.
And coming in as an A&R guy, was that where you learned a lot of the producer side that would come back to help you later on when you were working in the studio with them? Yeah.
Yeah, well, not so much in this. I mean, I didn't learn. I spent very little time in the studio before I started producing, and I relied very heavily on my engineer. I'm technically inept. I really don't know anything about technology. The recording science. So everything I wanted, I would tell my engineer, and he would make it happen, and that was great. But I tell you, I learned a lot about producing, I think, from editing on a splicing block in my office with a razor blade, because they'd come to me and say, "Look, Tom, this is a 7.5-minute song, like For the Love of Money by the OJs, or Long Cool Woman by the Hollies, or Hold Your Head Up by Argent." They were long album cuts, and I had to bring them in at like 3 minutes, ideally 2 minutes and 58 seconds. So I would try to produce, to make a single out of these huge long songs by trimming the fat and keeping, trying to make it a great structure, a commercial structure. And, in saying, I can cut right here, I do it, and then I discovered that, on the left side of the splice, the drummer was playing the ride cymbal, and on the right side of the splice, he was playing, the hi-hat. So I learned to listen through the music. I learned to hear all of the various instruments at the same time. I could either listen to the song or I could isolate instruments. So, I also have a really, really great memory for notes. I remember everything that's played in a record. So, I can recite sequences of numbers and sequences of notes. If I hear a guitar solo, 6 or 7 times, I can pretty much give it to you note for note. And that really made it easy for me to work with musicians, because I could minimize their time in front of the mic or with their instrument just by telling them to play along, to play what you just played, and I'll get you in and out of record. Don't even think about it, just play. So I would know where he screwed up. I'd know to punch in there, and I'd know where to get out, and that was good. They appreciated that, and it made the work go quickly.
When you talk about the technical side, it reminds me of a filmmaker where a director doesn't necessarily shoot, and he's not necessarily pushing the buttons in the edit suite, but it's still his vision. Would that be a fair way to do your approach in terms of producing a record? Or you may not be engineering and you may not be mixing, but it's more like
Absolutely.
A film director where your vision is overseeing the whole process.
Yeah. Well, yes. It's kind of I think, relative to a movie, it's much more impromptu because I kind of sat there. It was a very passive experience for me. I would sit in the control room and hear the song go by, 10 times, 20 times a day, one song. And all of a sudden I'd start hearing things in my head. I'd hear a Hammond organ, I'd hear piano, I'd hear a harmony, because, you're sitting there listening to this song, you want to make it better, and things occur to you. So you walk into the studio and say, listen, let's try this. It's not that you have a goal in mind. I did for a few songs, like Every Rose. As soon as he played it, I heard a really kind of schmaltzy ballad like the one I made.
Yeah.
With oohs and ahs and string sections and things like that. And so I wanted to get there. I had a goal in the studio. But with other things, mainly Cheap Trick stuff, they'd come in with ideas, not necessarily finished songs. So Rick would present a chorus, and then he'd present a verse from another song, and we would try to put it together. And a lot of really good work without planning was done in the studio with them. With other bands that were not so quickly able to change direction or improvise. In other words, bands that couldn't play that well. I would do some really thorough pre-production, and I would use a boombox and record it, and then we'd play it. I'd perfect it in the rehearsal, and then we'd play it back in the studio to remind ourselves of the changes we made and what we were going to do, and pretty much stick to that.
When you jumped into the studio with Cheap Trick, on the first record you worked with them, what was your goal? What was your vision to do with them?
I wanted, because of they had made a record with Jack Douglas, a really good record, but not terribly commercial. So, as with most bands that I produced, I wanted first and foremost to get a hit single. I worked for the record company, and if you had, in the 70s, if you were an album artist, an FM artist, and you had a hit single, you could immediately sell 1 million albums that you wouldn't have sold if you only got played on FM radio. So, I made the first, as soon as Ted had Cat Scratch Fever, his whole career broke wide open because it was a single. We never really had a big hit single with Cheap Trick. Their first big hit single was Budokan, I Want You to Want Me, that version. We came close with a couple, but not really. And then, I can tell you, there were hit singles that broke pretty much every band I worked with, and it gave them a career. It wasn't just an album of good songs. It was a hit, a big airplay record. So that was that was my job.
Yeah.
Get these guys a hit, and then after they've had a hit, then they can do basically what they want because they've got an audience who appreciates them.
And when working with these bands, your background as a musician, how much did that come to help you in helping them craft songs and performances? I
could work very well with guitarists. We pretty much got along very well. And occasionally I would play rhythm guitar on a couple of songs. I did all the percussion on all of the records I ever produced. I just told the band, let me come in and spend a couple of hours and put all kinds of stuff on the record, and if you don't like it, we'll hire someone. And I never had to hire anybody. That's just a rhythmic thing that I was born with. The guitar stuff I understood a lot about, I don't know, guitar sound and guitar playing, though I was not by any stretch a lead guitar player. When I started playing in college, there were rhythm guitarists. There were people who played lead and people who played rhythm. John Lennon was a rhythm guitarist. David Crosby. Even Pete Townsend, really. I mean, he was a good lead guitarist, but he really made his mark with his right hand, not his left hand.
You did 3 records with Cheap Trick.
Yeah.
How did they evolve over the time that you worked with them, and how did you evolve in terms of what you were going for?
Well, it's hard. They didn't evolve that much. They got more sophisticated. Rick got a little more into arrangements and strings and things like that. But they were my favorite band of all time to work with. They were brilliant in the studio, fast, clever, funny. We did a lot of laughing. Bunny would do the drum tracks in a couple of days. Robin could do 3 vocals with harmonies and doubles in one day. They were just astonishing, really. I had so much fun working with them, and I was bummed when they went to George Martin. But who could complain? Say George Martin, but actually he didn't make a hit with them. They kept bouncing from one guy to another after that. I think they were probably like a couple of other bands that I've worked with, a little dissatisfied with the cleanliness of the record and the poppiness of the records. But the record buying public liked my records. It's just that the band said we want to rock harder. Okay. Some of them re-recorded. Twisted Sister re-recorded their record. It sold 25,000 copies. Ours sold 5 million.
And was that more to do with just getting the rights so that they could sell out to movies and stuff, or was it because they were dissatisfied with the actual recording?
No, I don't get any. I mean, my piece is irrelevant. Is tiny.
I just mean from the record label. If they re-record it themselves, and then they own those copies, and they could sell it for films and commercials and that kind of stuff.
That's true, and that they could do it for that, but really in this case they did it because Dee Snider, thought I ruined his record, which 5 million people bought.
Yeah.
And he wanted to make it the way it should have been made, because I destroyed it. I mean, he wrote some really, really nasty things about me in his book. Just wasn't nice. But he was wrong. So, their album made no impact at all, and everybody liked the original. But bands do this, and I think Cheap Trick felt the same way a little bit, so they went on to other producers, none of whom made a hit with them or a hit record with them, really.
How frustrating is that to have to defend yourself 20 years later on something that was a massive success then?
Well, that's the deal. It's not that frustrating because it was a massive success. If it had been a failure, then they could have said, this guy blew it. He didn't know what he was doing. But I, every single band I worked with, I made their biggest record. When I stopped working with them, and this sounds really egotistical and self-serving. But when I stopped working with the bands I produced, they basically went away. I mean, I made their biggest records, and then they peaked, and that was it. So, that's my proof. That's what I can point to.
Yeah, it makes it a lot easier to brush off comments when you can just point at the numbers like that.
Right. I didn't, I made the record for you. I tried to help you realize your musical vision, but you hired me, because I was successful. And that was it. Meanwhile, when the 1990 came around, no one would go near me because I was successful in the 80s.
Oh, that's how it goes.
Yeah.
Too much success, and if the musical climate shifts, then instant dinosaur.
I understood that.
Yeah.
I understood it, and I went with it. I left, so it's okay. It was an age-appropriate decision. It doesn't make real sense for most 55-year-old people to make records for teenagers.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's a handful of really brilliant producers who have endured into their 60s, 70s. It's amazing, really. Really good ones like Phil Ramone and Tom Dowd. Jerry Wexler, Arif Martin. They're legends and brilliant guys who deal also in a kind of music that is not exclusively for teenagers.
True. Yeah. Now, when you worked with Dokken on Tooth and Nail, it was a very drastic change in sound from the record before to that record. Obviously, you had Jeff Pilson, which you have a pretty good history with. What was your approach to that? What'd you come in to do with that record? That it's night and day between the two records.
It was so long ago, and I think what you're talking about may have something to do with the fact that I did not mix the record. Michael Wagner mixed the record because George and I did not get along. George is a brilliant guitarist, one of the very best I've ever seen, really. But he had major issues. He wasn't exactly a people person. And I finally said I can't really do this anymore. So I called their managers and made negotiated a settlement so that I would, Michael would get a point, I'd get 3, something like that. I'm not sure, but I said I'll finish the recording, but I want off the project. So I got off the project. Meanwhile, it was a shame because George Lynch is just a brilliant guitar player, and when you hear the solo to the song Tooth and Nail, it's just astonishing. I mean, no one can play like that, or no one could in those days. He was as good as Eddie. I think Eddie Van Halen, a major shredder, but he never realized his potential. I think other things, personality and issues may have gotten in his way. But I didn't do anything. They were a pretty commercial band. Don Dokken was a commercial writer, and it's funny because that was the first time really that I resorted to, or we resorted to, a ballad, a power ballad. And I became kind of a master of the power ballad, which was a proven and unfortunate way to get a lot of rock bands on the radio. I mean, you'd throw in the kitchen sink, I don't know, Don't Close Your Eyes.
And Alone Again was on that as well.
Right, Alone Again. There were so many Home Sweet Home and Every Rose. You know, those are huge songs, but not what the band is known for.
That's right.
So it's interesting. And Alone Again was the only, I think, commercial track on that record.
Yeah, that one was definitely a slow build. I think it definitely took off more with later as the next record got them bigger. Tooth and Nail kind of rose along with it.
Yeah, well, I remember very little, honestly, about that right now. It was 45 years ago. No, 40 years ago.
Yeah. Now, how did you get involved with Mötley Crüe?
I left CBS, left Epic Records in 1982, and went to Elektra as head of A&R. Very briefly until they switched presidents. Joe Smith was elevated, and they brought in Bob Krasnow, and Bob Krasnow and I did not see eye to eye on rock and roll. He wanted to drop Mötley Crüe right away. And fortunately, I left. I said, no, you're not letting me be head of A&R. So we made a deal for me to leave, and they asked if I would do 3 records for them, a little production deal. And I said, sure. So Tom Zutaut, who was my assistant and had signed Mötley Crüe to Elektra, went to bat for me to produce the record. He thought I would be a good producer for Mötley Crüe. So we had a meeting in my office, and it was rough, but they said okay. And I think it was mainly Tommy who was in my, behind me. And that was it. We went in and did Shout. And it happened. It happened big and quick.
When you look at Mötley Crüe, the records you did, say Shout at the Devil, Theater of Pain, Girls, 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 to my ears, they all sound very different.
Well, yeah. Shout was dirtier, more bottom. By the time we got to Girls, it was a more refined sound. I think Mick's guitar sound came a long way, and I really liked it on Girls, Girls, Girls and Wild Side. And, Tommy was starting to experiment with electronic drums and things like that, and triggers and samples. It was quite different. Theater of Pain was a very difficult album to make. They were heavily into drugs at the time, and they were between tours. They had to, we had to really crank it out. That's one of the things that was tough about being a producer in those days, because if you were going to release an album, you had to be on the road to support it. And Dream Police, for example, had to be made to a deadline, because the band had a tour, a big tour. I think they'd like go out and open up for Aerosmith or something like that, or Kiss even. They used to open for Kiss. And I made that album in 30 days, start to finish. And in those days, that was astonishing, because we used to take 3 months to make an album. 3 months and $200,000. I mean, they were real projects. So we set up, we rehearsed, set up, did basic tracks, did all the overdubs, and mixed and delivered the album in 30 days. And that was quite something, because I think it's a really good album, Dream Police. So that was the deal there. I can't recall your question that actually prompted that answer.
It started with just the change in sound on every Mötley Crüe record that you did.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, right, and the other thing is different engineers. Shout was one guy, and then I changed because he wasn't really trustworthy. So I changed. He left L.A. owing a lot of people a lot of money, among other things. But yeah, that'll make a big difference too. The way a guy records a record.
Sure. Yeah, but even like the image, the sound, they definitely changed it up every time. Did they come to you with a new thing they wanted to do, or was this more of a natural progression?
Just a natural progression. I can't remember any band coming in and saying, here's the kind of record we want to make. We want to sound like. The only thing most of them did, which was kind of amusing, was for the first record I did with every band, they all said, we want to record live. We want to set up in the studio and record live. And for the first couple of times this happened, we kind of, I went along with it. I said, okay. And then I learned pretty quickly that I could really make it a brief thing and bring them around to my side by setting them up, saying, okay, we'll record a couple of tracks, and then you'll come in and listen, and we'll see how it is, okay? And we'd put them out there. We'd try to isolate, the drums and give everybody a space, and we'd make it pretty good for everybody being in one room. But then they'd come in and we'd solo like the bass, and the look of horror that would come over the bass player's face was priceless. And it would be, oh my, that is so bad, because these bands, first time in the studio, they don't understand the microscopic approach of a microphone. It hears things that the human ear hear, and these guys have been spending all of the preceding years trying to hear each other, trying to hear themselves over the other guys on stage. They had really no idea of how imprecise their playing was. So you'd isolate, you'd solo a few instruments, and they'd say, "Oh, okay, all right, I think we better," because what you'd wind up doing was simply re-recording every track separately. You'd say, "Okay, we got a good drum track, let's do the bass. Okay, we've got a good bass and drums, let's do the rhythm guitar." And that's the same. It's the same way as the way I wanted to do it, which was to get a good drum track and then overdub the bass, then overdub the guitars, and do that. And that's how we built. That's how I produced. I just built a pyramid of sound with a very strong foundation.
To me, that sounds like the psychology of kind of getting these guys to do what you wanted in a way that made them feel comfortable with the decision. How much of that did you have to play? How many games like that did you have to play with bands in the studio?
Well, I always told them I would fight for my perspective. If they wanted to do something badly and I didn't want to do it, or the other way around, I'd say, listen, when it comes right down to it, after I've heard your case and you've heard my case, it's your game. You've hired me. I'm here. I'm being paid by you, so it's your decision. But meanwhile, I'm going to do everything I can to persuade you to do it my way. But I'm here to help you realize your musical vision, and if that's what you envision, then fine. Most of the time, I won. Most of the time, they would go with my desire, musical ideas. But really, the bands didn't come up with that many great ideas, or that many bad ideas. I would just keep things moving along so that they didn't get stuck in a rut and say, and have to come up with an idea. I'd introduce a new thing, and kind of distract them with that, so they wouldn't think too hard about what they're doing. And a lot of these bands, they were serious. Like Nikki Sixx is really serious about Motley Crue. Some of the other guys maybe not so much, and maybe they wanted to get out so they could go to this club or party here or party there. Tommy's pretty serious too. But a lot of them, I guess what I'm trying to say is they didn't necessarily care as much about musical input as I did. So I'd work a little harder to achieve what I thought was right than they would. They'd kind of give up. Okay, all right, let's do it. Come on.
At what point during the early 90s did you realize, there's a shift happening here?
Oh man, there was an instant, and I'll always remember it. I was leaving the house to go to the studio. My daughter, who is now 41, was playing "License to Ill," the Beasties, and I was listening to it on my way down the stairs, and I stopped at the front door and I said, Julia, how can you listen to that? It sounds like it was recorded in 5 minutes. And she said, Dad, that's exactly it. And I went, uh-oh. Everything I know is wrong. So I knew that something was changing there, because there was all of a sudden this total disregard for tuning, time, meter, everything that I insisted on because I wanted power in music. They didn't want. It sounds too good. Leave it out of tune. Leave it out of time. Let's just rock out and not be corporate. Meanwhile, in order to make powerful music, I felt that you needed to have everything in really good time and perfectly tuned. Control. The Seattle bands wanted a lack of control, and immediately I knew that it was going downhill from there for me, because it was obvious that these bands had no respect for corporate rock, and anybody who was as closely associated with corporate rock as I was would be an embarrassment to them. If they worked with me, they'd have no street credibility. So I prepared to leave.
A lot of bands try to incorporate some of those sounds to try to maintain relevance. What did you decide to do at that point?
I'm not sure I understand incorporate what sound.
In terms of the sounds of grunge, a lot of bands really tried to stay relevant. They tried to incorporate some of those sounds into what they were doing, so they could stay relevant. Yeah. What did you decide you were going to do at that point?
I would never do that. I honestly didn't like most of what I heard. Songs they started for me to sound a little bit samey. They were writing different songs in different modes with different chords and complaining and whining a lot and saying, "Oh God, things are so bad, and you're ugly and I'm ugly and I'm not happy, and I've got issues," and and of course I didn't think that rock and roll or music should be, come on baby, let's rock all night long forever. But I started to, I didn't really like the music that was coming out of Seattle, which is strange because I love the Foo Fighters. They're the only band I love in the last 10 years. And I love Nirvana. But I didn't like a lot of the stuff that wasn't. I mean, Nirvana was in tune and in time. They were good. But, the Beasties made I know they're very well respected and loved, but they insisted on not caring. And people loved that. I said, this does not move me. This does not make me clench my fist. This does not, inspire me. But there were, songs of ZZ Top inspired me. LaGrange inspired me. There are a few songs that were made by kind of punk new wave bands that I loved. Ministry, Jesus Built My Hot Rod. Unbelievable song. Unbelievable. But for the most part, no.
So what did you decide to do then from the early 90s, say, until the Rockstar film? What were you doing in terms of your career?
I kind of was recognizing that I didn't get called as much, that the artists I was offered were on a smaller level. They were not as major as the artists I had been working with. And I could kind of see a trend. I played a lot of golf in the 90s. I really did. And in the latter part of the 90s, I started to try to reinvent myself, and I went around to all the record company presidents and I said, "Listen, I have an idea for a position that you need, and I'm that guy." And they all said, "Well, Tom, we respect what you've done, but I think we're okay, and we really don't need that kind of guy." I wanted to be a behind-the-scenes advisor, troubleshooter, who had been on both sides of the coin, who had been an independent producer and an A&R guy for a label who hired producers, and try to teach the young A&R staff how to make better records for less money. And if they were having a tough time with a vocalist or a drummer or whatever, I would consult. They'd send me into the studio and I'd try to help out. Because I'd worked with so many, I don't know, do you say difficult bands, marginally
volatile bands?
Or marginally talented musicians. I mean, Ricky Rocket of Poison would just, readily admit that he's not a great drummer, but he tried really hard. But he said that. He said, "I know I'm not a great drummer." I brought in, we were in rehearsal once, and I brought in Bunny Carlos to help out because Ricky was having trouble, with certain turnarounds and certain beats and certain fills. That's what I would have done. But nobody was interested. So I took a job briefly with a catalog company, marketing Virgin and Capitol catalog, making best ofs and stuff like that. And then I did Rockstar and said goodbye. I read a book. I read a little book called Who Moved My Cheese? And it was about unanticipated change and how to handle it. And it just socked me right in the face. I just couldn't believe I'd been wasting all this time. And in the space of 4 months, I sold my house and bought this place, and we were living here. In 4 months, I flew east, found this, and a year later, I started a new life.
And was that right after Rockstar was done?
Right after. Yeah.
And
It's 2001.
in terms of Rockstar, working with Jeff Pilson again after all those years, because he's evolved into quite a good producer, and he's very,
Yeah.
very busy. What kind of growth had you seen in him?
Well, he was always a very mature, agreeable, affable, talented guy. I wanted him because of that, because he knew what he was doing and he was a team player. And I had Jason Bonham and Zach Wilde in the studio, and that is not easy at all. And they really didn't get along either. So I needed Jeff to be team captain of the band, and he was great. He's always been great. No problem. He's a real pleasure to work with.
That movie may not have been a massive success, but it still has a lot of fans. And in terms of the music, it seems like a real nice high point for you to finish off that side of your career.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a lot of fun. The problem was, I don't remember the exact dates, but I think it came out very just before 9/11.
I think so too. Like within days, yeah.
And it was just completely buried, as was everything else by 9/11. And I think it's done pretty well on video. You know, it was great fun to meet. You know, Jennifer Aniston brought Brad to a couple of you know, like rap parties and things like that, and I learned a lot about the movie business. I have so much respect for movie directors. You know, record producing is tough, but movie directing is just it is truly awesome in the real sense of the word. You know?
Now, as we wrap up, in terms of Stoneover Farms,
yeah,
that's a fascinating move to me, and it sounds like a wonderful break from the last, you know, the previous 30, 25 years or so of producing.
Yeah.
You read a book, you decided I'm changing my life. Tell me about that process and what it's given you with this new life.
Well, you know, for the first 30 years of my life, well, I spent 20 years in the studio in a windowless room, telling the front desk who could come in and who they could put through on the phone, and not wanting to be disturbed. So I didn't meet many people, and it became this is nothing but meeting people, and so it's pretty refreshing to me. It was a new thing at age 50. How old was I? I can't remember. You know, about 58. And it's very difficult to express exactly how there are similarities between record producing and innkeeping.
Yeah.
But there are.
Oh, really?
You need to be very detail oriented, very organized, kind of obsessed with your immediate environment, and you need to take a whole bunch of separate items, put them together, and offer them to the public and have them say, "Whoa, this is great. I like this." I had stayed at bed and breakfasts on and off for my whole life, and I always wondered why they were all exactly the same, which was loaded with fabric and devoid of any conveniences. You know, if you had a china wash basin in your room, that was great. I've been in bed and breakfast where you didn't even have a radio in the room, you know, in the old days. So I said, I can do this. I had the funds to be able to establish a very a high-end, all suites, all conveniences bed and breakfast, which was, a luxury bed and breakfast is an oxymoron. And there was no such thing. And we're still the only one I know of. There are plenty of luxury hotels and luxury inns and luxury resorts, but not B&Bs, because most people inherit a huge house, can't pay the taxes, and start taking in boarders. And that's how B&Bs evolved. But I'm from Boston, and I'm a Yankee, and I like Massachusetts a lot. And this is the best part of Massachusetts, except for Nantucket. And it's beautiful up here. It's loaded with culture. There's tons of theater and dance and music and art. And it bills itself as America's premier cultural resort. And the people are great. It's a nice community. It's kind of like going back to the 50s. There's no crime. There are no lines. There's no traffic. But it's very stimulating, and it's beautiful. So I wanted, when I came up here, I just wanted to. I said I could live here. This is great. And of course, we went from Laurel Canyon in Los Angeles and gridlock to the country. I mean, there are woods here.
Yeah, it is stunning. Did you buy something that was established, or did you build it from scratch?
We bought a big farm that was built in 1890, and we renovated it. And it was not a B&B when we bought it. It had a license to be a B&B, and it was on a special permit by the town. But we gutted some floors, and we only have 5 accommodations. I wanted it to be small. And it doesn't really make money. It just, there's no giant profit in this. It just pays for our life. It pays all of our expenses. We can take vacations. I can belong to a golf club, and it literally, and it pays the mortgage. It pays for itself. So, it's a very pleasant life. It's not a job that I dislike in any way. There are lots of rewards, and there are lots of fun. There's lots of fun, and it's about routine, and I like that. A lot of people don't, but I like routine. I mean, I get up at in the summertime when we're absolutely jammed. I get up at 6:30 every day. I set up breakfast and put everything together for 14 people or 12 people. And it's like a Zen thing. I don't even think about what I'm doing. I think about other things, and I really enjoy the process. So that's it. And really, it's a very fortunate position to be in, because people pay you a substantial amount of money, and you do very little work for it once you've established the premises. And I make a killer breakfast. We have an assistant who puts out the wine and cheese. I sit down, have a drink, have some cheese and crackers, talk with the guests. I put in a few hours a day. It's good.
That was Tom Werman. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked what you heard, you can find over 50 other extended interviews archived at thedoublestop.com. I'll see you next week with another brand new interview.
Rest my soul, taste my life, for my bread, spend my time lost in space. Am I dead? Oh, let the river flow through my calloused hands.